This year, we're very pleased to have with us Peter Gutmann, who is with the University of Auckland in New Zealand. He is one of the great people in our field. He's done marvelous work for quite a number of years, is one of the most entertaining to read, acerbic commentators. He has great things always to say, and so we're very, very pleased that he could come all the way from New Zealand for us to talk to us about this problem that he wants to talk about. All right, thank you very much, Peter.
Okay, so I thought I would talk about this particular topic. The reason why I want to talk about browser security is that it's one of the most visible aspects of internet security. Virtually anybody who interacts with the internet deals with the browser in some way. So large numbers of people experience it, and it also makes a very good example to talk about. So this is basically the security value proposition you get from web browsers. You go to a website, if there's no certificate, it's unsafe. If it has a certificate, it's safe. Purely binary. So here's an example of a safe website according to the web browser. This site, they're doing paper install malware, has a certificate, therefore it's perfectly safe. Here's another example. I'm not sure how visible that is. These guys do credit cards, change of billing, ATM fraud, credit card dumps, spam hosting, phishing, you name it. But it's got a certificate, so it's safe. The scary thing about this is the CAs are busy selling certificates to the very criminals that they're supposed to be protecting us from. Here's another safe, trustworthy site. These guys do DDoS attacks, and it's the fact that it's got a certificate isn't that obvious, but there is a padlock up there, so this does have a certificate. These are all issued by commercial CAs, so these aren't self-signed certificates or anything like that. These are bought from commercial CAs. Here's another safe, trustworthy site, according to the browser security indicators. These guys do credit card fraud. There's lots and lots and lots of these out there. On the other hand, here's an unsafe site, BofA, bankofamerica.com. Here's another untrustworthy site, Bank of Ireland. Okay, is the mic not audible? Okay. This was Visa.com a couple of years ago. This is Visa.com today, so they're very consistent over time. They've got a good track record there. YouTube, Twitter, and so on and so forth. So the internet really is a dangerous site, but luckily the browsers are really good at separating the dangerous sites from these safe sites. But it gets even worse. This is a genuine banking site. This is not a phishing site, this is the actual banking site. I'll skip past this relatively quickly. If you click on the verified sites here, you get that. Again, I'm not sure how visible that is, but it basically tells you that it's encrypted and it's got a valid certificate and so on and so forth. Can anyone see what was wrong with this, with that? Yep, no SSL. The thing is, everything on that site, including the security indicator, tells you that site is secure. The only thing that's missing is a tiny SSL indicator. This was tested in a real-world environment against non-volunteer participants, and 100% of them were fooled. And it was tested a second time against this room full of hardcore geeks, sort of Linux kernel hackers with pizza stains on their bed. And even then, it took multiple iterations of explanation to convince them that this was actually a problem. People would say, well, this is for commercial sites and banks and so on. I'm running SSL on my own web server. I've got my own certificate. This isn't going to happen to me. This was done using SSL script. That's a Meraki. There's a cheaper version of this, costs $29.95, and it's just big enough to run a Linux kernel with SSL script compiled into it. And that does this stripping of SSL. And as far as the users are concerned, the site is completely safe, even though there's no encryption happening. So let's revisit the browser value proposition. That's what it actually is. If there's a non-commercial CA certificate, it's not safe. If there's no certificate or a CA certificate from a commercial CA, it's safe. This is CA cert. This is a non-commercial CA. These guys will not sell certificates to the Russian mafia. They actually do verify who they're giving certificates to. They've been trying to get into web browsers since Phoenix 0.3, and they still haven't quite made it in yet. Any commercial CA can make it in, no problems. So the problem with this is that there is absolutely no diversification of defences. You've got one single point of failure. That picture there is an example of a single point of failure. This was from the Hyatt Regency Hotel. So, not a Hilton, a Hyatt. they had a skywalk built in this gigantic atrium, and the way it was supposed to be done, there was a series of skywalks with a vertical bar, and they were going to bolt all the skywalks to it. However, threading all these skywalks onto this bar was extremely difficult. The architects had designed something that the builders couldn't actually build. So the builders cut this ceiling support into a series of shorter segments, bolted the first skywalk to that, bolted the second segment of bar to the first skywalk, and so on all the way down. So the problem is that instead of each attachment point carrying the weight of one single skywalk, the top attachment point carried the weight of everything below it. And one day there was some event, there was about 1,600 people at this event, and lots of people on the skywalks, and the load was sufficient that all the skywalks collapsed and killed all 114 people. So they basically took something that had no single point of failure and converted it into something with a single point of failure. So doing diversification of defences is not the same as defence in depth. This is a view of aerial view of World War I trench lines. This is defence in depth, so you've just got one line of defence after the other. And what you do with that is you knock out the first line, the second, the third, the fourth, and so on, and then you're through. So defence in depth is a series of layered defences, whereas diversification of defences is multiple independent defences. This is a standard aspect of physical security. So in architecture, it's something called CEP10, crime prevention through environmental design, which basically means structuring the physical environment in a way that it minimises the propensity for it to support crime. And this has been around for an awfully long time. So basically you analyse the intended use. You analyse the intended use of an area, and then you examine how you can arrange it to minimise crime. This is an example of some random urban environment, and I'll get into the security features of that in a minute. So it takes standard security features that most people are familiar with, provide adequate lighting, minimise shrubbery for people to hide in, and so on and so forth. This is an example of this taken to, I think, ridiculous extremes. This is Fort ATF in Washington. This was designed against one single threat model, which is car bombs and truck bombs. So that you can see this entire enormous site. The only part of it that's actually used is that central concrete block in the middle. All the stuff in the front, that's concrete bollards, that weird aerial, whatever that thing is designed to prevent blast damage. So you've got these wide open streets, bollards to prevent anyone with a car or truck from getting too close. The building itself is a concrete bunker, very narrow slit windows, so you haven't got a lot of exposed surface to capture the blast. And it's designed for one single threat and nothing else. So this is kind of a ridiculous level of defence against one threat and nothing else. So what CEP10 does is it also takes much less obvious defences. One example of this is based on the concept of eyes on the street, which was developed by an urban activist called Jane Jacobs in the 1960s. So the idea behind this is you have windows facing out onto the street, and the buildings where the windows are structured in such a way that people tend to be behind those windows and you're observing the street. So you have someone can't get away with committing some sort of crime on the street without being observed. An example of this is, usually with an office building, you've got the car park in the basement or behind the building. If you put it directly out in front of the offices, everyone sitting in the offices is looking out onto the car park, and so the chances of someone breaking into a car unobserved is greatly reduced. Same thing for schools. You hide the bike sheds around the back, or if you put them in front of the school classroom windows, anyone interfering with a bike will be seen. So that's this eyes on the street concept. Residential buildings, you have glazed balconies. So it encourages people to sit in them, and then providing this street surveillance at no cost. So this is an example of a random street that has a pile of these features. First of all, it's not a public thoroughfare, so there's a lot of pedestrian traffic there. This isn't a post photo, this is apparently an actual photo of somewhere in Europe. Car parking is directly in front of the houses, so the cars will be observed. There's glazed-in areas up on the top to encourage people to sit in them. Something else that I haven't covered yet, which I'll cover in a minute, is that there's this fenced-off space you can see just in front of the buildings with a hedge, where the owners of the buildings have little patios and they put potted plants and tables and whatnot out there. And that does two things. First of all, again, it encourages them to sit there and provide that eyes on the street surveillance. And secondly, it encourages them to own that particular private space. The problem with public spaces is that they are public and shared. No one owns them, no one takes care of them, no one maintains them. By doing this, you've actually changed it so that that belongs to the person who lives in it, or people who live in the house, and so they maintain it and take care of it. So this is something that has a huge, and there's a bunch of other stuff here which I won't go into in too much detail, but there's a large number of security features here which should be added, and it looks like a standard residential street, not Fort ATF. So it has a lot of security without it being obvious in your face security. Some other examples. You put ATMs in the street, full view of passers-by. Have you ever wondered why someone put an ATM where anybody can observe you entering your PIN? That's deliberate, because that means that nobody can hide around the corner and bug you or attack you. They almost got this one right. This isn't a public shopping area, so there's lots of foot traffic. There will always be people around. They put a roof over as well, though, and there's that pit around the corner where someone can hide and grab you after you've withdrawn your cash, but it's mostly correct. Residential houses, you can use these for passive surveillance. So the standard way of orienting houses in a street is they face straight out onto a street. But if you've got a cul-de-sac, position them at 45 degrees so they're facing this way, or the view from the houses is out this way onto the street and the entrance to the cul-de-sac. Chances of someone, a stranger, wandering into the cul-de-sac without being seen are fairly low. There's high occupancy areas in houses, like, for example, kitchens. You face those out onto the street entrance. So in that case, you've got the kitchen, which is between the main entrance and the garage there. Faces out there. If anyone happens to be in the kitchen, they can observe anyone going into the garage, maybe to review with the cars or coming up to the front door. The kitchen, in this way, predates century by centuries. In older houses, particularly in Europe, the kitchen is near the main entrance to the house, so anyone who's coming in can be observed from there. And then there's much, much less obvious measures. Eliminate features that provide easy access to roofs. As an example here, there's no handrails on those posts, which makes them a lot more difficult to climb. It also uses glossy paint. So if you look at that roof there, it's basically an access way to the other story windows. But they've made it much more difficult to climb with glossy paint and the lack of handrails. This thing is called a living wall. So if you've got a wall that's subject to graffiti and you're worried about that, plant climbing plants along. And for one thing, it's nice and green and natural. And for another, it makes it very difficult to graffiti that wall. Here's another thing. This is a random hedge. It is in fact an acacia thorn hedge, which is something you don't ever want to actually have to try and walk through. The downside of this is in Australia, where it's very hot and dry, and acacia happens to burn very well. So in theory, you could actually get through this hedge, but someone is probably going to notice the hedge going up in flames. But again, this is not obviously a concrete fortress wall. It looks like a decorative hedge, which may discourage anyone from getting through to the other side. This is something very trivial. Paint areas are on nighttime lighting with bright reflective paint. That increases the effectiveness of the lighting. That sounds like incredibly trivial measures, glossy paint or white paint. On the other hand, it adds up to a considerable integrated defensive system. So you've got all of these things creating one unified defensive system. And whatever you do, don't just follow fixed rules. Here's an example. We can secure schools by installing CCTV cameras. While a lot of the people that vandalise schools do it to get their moment of fame on TV. That's an actual video from YouTube of some kids trashing a bus so that they could, well, it wasn't on TV, it was recorded with some cell phone camera. But the thing is, if you're telling kids, if you vandalise a school, we will put you on TV, that's exactly what they're after. So it's more or less exactly the opposite of what you want to do. Another example is I can provide lots of adequate lighting. There's a school playground lit up after dark. Well, it's kind of an invitation for unauthorised use. If you're a trespasser on the school grounds, you bring a football along, and if someone asks what you're doing there, well, we're just kicking a football around. And police are unlikely to prosecute you for doing something like that. So it's not only inviting people to go onto the school grounds after dark, but if they are there with malicious intent, it provides them an excuse for being there. In fact, you can do exactly the opposite. You can use darkness as a defensive strategy. In a building like that, there's an intruder in one of those rooms. No way of seeing which one it is, where they are. Now spot the intruder. So in this case, they've actually used darkness as a defensive strategy. What it does is it either forces or uses intruders to bring torches. And for anyone who's ever done any urban exploring, they know there's nothing that attracts police quicker than a torch flashing around inside an empty building. Or the other one is they can turn on lights. You wire the lights to an alarm, and the intruders are directly telling you where they are inside the building. So it pretty much reverses the conventional thinking about illumination for security. It makes darkness a part of the security. So that was architectural security. The thing is, as with architecture, the internet has a huge amount of diversifiable risk. So you don't need a single defensive mechanism. You can use a whole pile of different defences and combine them together. And the thing about this is, not only have you got this integrated defensive system, but if one of them fails, you don't get a complete failure of security. So here's a refresher. State-of-the-art security on the web. So what risk-based security assessment does is it doesn't have this Boolean black or white, certificate, no certificate. It treats it as a sliding scale. So it doesn't say good or bad, it says probably safe or probably unsafe. If you look at web browsers, they already do something like this for privacy. There's a sliding scale, but it involves this mind-numbing amount of detail about choosing cookie handling and stuff like that. So when you do this, get usability people to work with this. Microsoft has been doing this for a long time. This is the Exchange spam filter. And again, it doesn't say is spam reject or is not spam allow. It has a sliding scale, and so I can treat messages based on how risky they are, or at least how likely they are to be spam. This is a horrible user interface, so don't follow this user interface, but certainly follow the general concept. So what users can do is they can choose to be highly risk averse. They can say, I want all the sites I go to pass some fairly stringent security checks. Or they can do the exact opposite. They can say, I don't really care, take me anywhere, which is the current default for browsers. And the browsers can also apply changes in risk tolerance. So if you're in a situation like that, which is a completely random, untrusted internet cafe in South America, they can say, this is a dangerous environment, I'm going to be very risk averse. If you connect it to your home network, that's probably going to be reasonably benign, and they can be a lot more tolerant. And this is something the computer can do. Windows 7 already does something like this when you connect to a wireless network. It asks you, is this a public network, a private network, or whatever, and then it applies different levels of paranoia as you interact with that network. And the thing about this is the browser knows about this, the user doesn't. The browser knows you're connecting to a Wi-Fi access point that you've never connected to before. The user has no idea, they just see that they've got an internet connection. So the browser and the computer is in a position to make these choices, and the user generally isn't. And for the internet security, it works pretty much like SecTech. There's no single silver bullet. There's lots of measures that you can use to make things better. And we also know that there are lots of things you can use to make things worse. So in SecTech, here's a classic danger sign. A combination of things that practically guarantee that you're going to run into problems. High-rise multi-unit housing for low-income earners, which, depending on which country you're from, is public housing, housing projects, housing estates, or whatever. Families with lots of young members, so don't think of them as children, think of them as youths. Shared communal entrances, and again, that bit I pointed out earlier, that you've got these communal entrances that don't belong to anybody, and so nobody maintains them, no one looks after them. And a bit of a more trivial thing, elevators feeding double hung corridors, which you typically find in hotels. You've got a central corridor, rooms to the left and right, and elevators. So this first came about in the 1960s and 1970s, where someone who worked for HUD, the US Housing Authority, looked through the crime statistics they keep. So being a government bureaucracy, they have to keep lots and lots of figures on everything, which generally people don't read. This guy actually went through and looked at them and noticed that the housing projects or whatever, which had the highest level of crime, also had all of these features. And so he wrote a book on this called Defensible Spaces, which eventually evolved into SecTech. So this was done purely based on empirical research. It wasn't some random academic theory. He simply looked at all the statistics they had and said, when you do this, then bad things happen, and when you do that, bad things don't happen. That's pretty much a recipe for disaster. This is a housing development called Pruitt-Igoe, which is kind of the Titanic of housing failures. So on the top there is an example of what the architects envisaged. So they had this public space with people doing, I don't know what they're doing in there, it's hard to tell, but let's say lots of handlers in there using it. The shot in the middle is the way they actually turned out. They got vandalised, nobody wanted to go there, no one wanted to live there. And at the bottom is how they resolved the problem at the end. If you go there now, there's basically second growth forest and a few ruined roads and stuff in between them. So this is pretty much an anti-pattern for how to do public housing. So the thing about this risk-based assessment, it's not a silver bullet. It's not, and I think that's the reason why browsers like certificates so much. It's a silver bullet. This is not. All it can say is it's maybe good, or it's probably bad, or it's probably good. One other thing it can do is it can tell you why it's probably good or why it's probably bad. Certificates don't really tell you anything. All they say is someone paid a CA for a certificate. If you use the security diversification, you can say, or you should be able to say at the end of it, that we think the site is unsafe because of this, this, and this. So it can reason about why it's unsafe. So the classic example of this is key continuity, which SSH has been using forever. You went to the site last week, it used this key, is it still using the same key this week? Typically certificates get rolled over once a year when the CA's renewal fee is due. So what your browser can do is check to make sure whether the key in the new certificate is the same as the old one. And again, fairly standard practice is you keep recertifying the same key year after year. Was the certificate issued by the same CA as the previous one? Generally, people keep going back to the same CA. They don't randomly switch CAs to someone in Iran, for example. Does the combination of the CA and the site location make sense? Did a CA in Brazil issue a certificate for a site in France? These are really simple, basic checks. Komodo Gate is an example that any one of these checks would have caught this. You know, you've got a CA, Google, Microsoft, and so on, major corporations, and suddenly there's a change of CA and they're being relocated to an ISP in Iran. The most trivial check would have caught this. Diginotar, exactly the same thing again. The browser vendors basically did nothing to correct this after Komodo Gate. Exactly the same thing happened again. Now, I'm not saying certificates are completely useless. They can still act as a risk mitigation measure. It's not a Boolean pass or fail. What you can say is the site has a certificate. Someone cared enough to pay for this, possibly with a stolen credit card, but still they cared enough to pay for this. Therefore, we'll move it slightly towards the more secure standards. And another problem at the moment with CAs is that they're all treated equally. The most negligent CA on the planet is treated no differently from the browser's point of view than the most careful CA on the planet. So if you're a CA, obviously you want to cut costs as much as possible and sell as many certificates as possible. So it incentivizes this race to the bottom, because it doesn't matter what you do, you'll be treated the same as a really, really careful CA. So with this, you can have trustworthy versus negligent CAs. If you've got a very negligent CA, you can give them a low safety rating. Trustworthy CAs get a much higher safety rating. And yeah, this is a very serious problem with the current Boolean pass or fail mechanism. There's no incentive for CAs to be careful because they still get the padlock no matter how bad they are. This also deals with the CA too big to fail problem. There have been a number of CAs, like a Diginotar is kind of an exception. They'd issued 700 certificates and they'd also issued 500 fraudulent ones, so it was okay to pull them out of the browsers. Any other CA that's been caught doing stuff they shouldn't, selling certificates to the Russian mafia, be too big to fail. No browser vendor is going to pull a major CA out of the browser. However, you can downgrade their credit rating. You can say this CA is obviously not very trustworthy because they keep selling certificates to the Russian mafia, so we'll downgrade their credit rating. It's exactly the same way that credit ratings agencies have done for risky financial ventures. Up to 2008, the ratings given out by credit ratings agencies were actually really, really good. Generally, if, let's say, Standard & Poor's said this company is likely to fail, there was a good chance they would fail. If they said this company is likely to do well, then there was a good chance they would do well. Unfortunately, after 2008, things got screwed up a bit. But historically, it's been a good indicator. So we can do the same thing for certificates. I don't necessarily want to name CAs, but I'm sure there are people who have heard of CAs that are maybe not so good and CAs that are much better. It's not that hard, so let's rate CAs based on how trustworthy they are. Another thing you can look at is the history of the interaction with the site over time. There's an example. So browsers already, if you dig down God knows how many levels into menus, it'll say you visited the site 5 times in the past. The browser never makes this visible to the user, so it's got all this information you could use to secure the user, and it doesn't actually tell the user. So that's an example of what the browser might, for example, say when you enter your password. It's encrypted, it's this particular site, you've been here 25 times in the past. Chances are this is the real PayPal. Here's the opposite of this. There's no encryption involved, so they haven't bothered getting a certificate. You've never been to the site before, and the URL looks a bit funny. And again, the browsers already have this information right now, they just don't make it visible to any of the users. You can use hosting information. A lot of the better-known sites are run from very well-known providers, and in many cases they actually have their own autonomous system or ACEs. So this is a large French bank, and that inserted in the bottom is the ACE for that bank. So it happens to match the bank name, it's located in France. It matches the bank name, it's located in the EU, it's been around since 1995. Chances are this is the genuine bank site. On the other hand, if you look at the AS information, and again, it's a pretty trivial lookup, the browser can do that in a couple of lines of code, and the AS is located in Eastern Europe, or was located yesterday, chances are that's unsafe. It probably isn't the genuine bank. And there's a whole bunch of things you can do with this. TTLs for DNS records, they're typically associated with fast flux botnets. Always look up for the domain. Check whether things like the ANMX and NS records are in the same data center. So it's typically you've got everything hosted in the same data center. If you've got a website hosted in one country and the MX in another country, that's kind of suspicious for, let's say, Amazon.com. Use stack fingerprinting to check the remote OS. And again, you're already communicating with a remote system. So why not do some static fingerprinting as you're doing this? Phishing sites, for example, are frequently hosted on botnets via reverse proxies. So let's say you're going to Amazon.com and it's running Windows 7 Home Premium. That probably isn't Amazon.com. Check whether the IP address block is assigned to something like DSL or cable modem provider. Again, Amazon.com is not going to be hosted off a DSL modem. And these are really, really simple, trivial checks. Beyond that, you can check the site contents. I won't go into this in too much detail. But basically, you use statistical classification techniques. Here's one really, really simple one. You use text mining. So you've gone to a web page, it looks like a banking web page. You use text mining to extract keywords from that page, most significant keywords. You push it into Google. If one of the first 10 results is that web page, then you're basically using Google as an independent third party to say, yes, this is probably the site. On the other hand, if the keywords you found are nowhere in those hits, then it hasn't been indexed by Google, it hasn't been around long, Google doesn't trust it, whatever. It's probably not the genuine site that you expect you're going to. And there's some actual results on this. Now the thing is, if you worry about the 10% false positive, remember this is not the only measure you use. This is one of the many, many measures. So the benefit of using a whole pile of different ways of assessing sites is that even if there is a false positive in this case, you've got a whole bunch of other measures that you apply as well. So one single false positive isn't going to knock out a site. The Wayback Machine. What did this site look like 6 months ago? Someone's hacked a server and put a fake banking page onto what used to be some random, who knows what, gift shop website or something like that. So did the site look substantially similar 6 months ago? One neat thing you can use, this is from discussions with companies that do malware or scanning for malicious websites. Visit it with a user agent other than the default Internet Explorer, something like Google or Googlebot, if you can get away with this, if you can come from an IP address range belonging to someone like Trend Micro, malicious sites deliberately change their content completely based on what they think is scanning them. So when Google goes through and scans for malicious content, they get a nice clean site. And when you come in with Internet Explorer, you get the malware. But in some cases, it's actually nearly destroyed the effectiveness of web scanning initiatives, because if you're coming from an IP address block assigned to some anti-malware company or Google or whatever, you'll get a totally different website than you will if you're coming from some random home user's address block. There's lots and lots of work that's been done on web page classification. And this has been used by anti-malware companies to search for malicious sites. There's a whole pile of these. I won't go into these in great detail, but basically these have been found to be effective through improving means. So again, like the guy who looked at the HUD crime statistics, anti-malware researchers and companies have found that malware websites tend to have these characteristics and benign ones don't. So there's, for example, div and iframe and so on, used to hide web bugs, carry out drive-by downloads. There's a whole bunch of things used for suspicious shell code, things like exploiting ActiveX controls, out-of-place elements. If you've got XSS, you can't control entirely the content of the page that you're injecting it into. So if you've got one web page embedded inside the middle of another web page or something like that, then that might be an example of cross-site scripting. Various malicious patterns pointing at exploit servers, even very simple stuff. There are various malware toolkits that use those particular strings. Now obviously the bad guys can defend against this, you're in a bit of an arms race. But how much does it cost to check for those particular strings, which are specific signs of exploit toolkits? So these are the ones that have been done by humans. Much more sophisticated work has been done with Bayesian classifiers and support vector machines. So what these do is, particularly the support vector machines, is they extract non-obvious features out of existing data sets. So one thing that was completely non-obvious is the string members in the URL. Apparently there's a lot of phishing and malware sites hosted on members.aol.com and members.tripod.com and so on. No humans had ever noticed this, but Bayesian classifiers actually extracted that from the data. Who owns the IP ranges for DNS records? And this is, again, I'm not trying to malign anyone, this is extracted from actual real-world data that registrars like Ripe in Europe are least likely to register malicious sites, whereas GoDaddy is quite popular with people registering malicious sites. So again, that increases or decreases the risk level based on the registrarables. One thing that's particularly effective is checking JavaScript. because if you've got obviously malicious JavaScript, it's pretty easily detected. If you've got obfuscated JavaScript, it looks nothing like what a legitimate website would look like. So either way, you're screwed. And again, using statistical analysis, here's a whole bunch of things that people have done to find signs of malicious JavaScript. Now, all the stuff I'm quoting here, this is all from actual research, so either academic research or anti-malware companies have established all this data. So it isn't just theorizing, this is actual real-world data and has been tested on real-world sites. So I'll skip through some of these. It's basically just certain code patterns or things that happen in code that are much, much more prevalent in malicious JavaScript than they are in legitimate websites. And yeah, lots more stuff like this. So in case you know, the counter-argument to this is, okay, we'll have an antivirus-style arms race. The bad guys will just engage in an arms race. Well, it's actually not that easy. Because if you're doing something like SQL injection or XSS or other injection attacks, you don't have complete control over the target web page because you're injecting your own content into someone else's web page. You can't actually have very complete control. You've got malformed strings, out-of-place elements, things like that. And no script already uses exactly this kind of detection to try and detect where something's gone wrong and then block content on the page. Again, obfuscating JavaScript isn't that hard. There are actually commercial toolkits you can buy to do this. The result of this, however, is a web page that looks absolutely nothing like a genuine legitimate website. One problem with this, and again this is from talking to anti-malware vendors, is that some legitimate websites actually use obfuscated JavaScript to protect their intellectual property, meaning that somebody fell for a scareware marketing campaign. So they've actually had some luck with going to these companies and saying your website has all the characteristics of a site that's run by the Russian mafia. You probably don't want to do this. The thing about this is, in terms of legal liability, and the lawyers have looked at this in terms of legal liability. They're not saying your website looks like a Russian mafia website. They're saying it has the characteristics of a site that is run by the Russian mafia, and that gets around any legal liability issues. So okay, let's get back to this value proposition. On the left there is the existing browser-based one. No certificate has a certificate. This is the risk assessment-based one. So you've got a whole bunch of measures. You've been to this site a number of times before. OS is Red Hat Enterprise Linux, not Windows 7 Home Premium. Same location as the AS, and so on and so forth. Basically, you've got this history of the site being legitimate as far as you can see, from a reputable CA and so on and so forth. So all these measures total over 100%. I've kind of normalised it here. This is somewhat arbitrary. I've normalised this so you get the same 100% that you get with certificates. In fact, the rating may go well over 100%. And this indicates the fault-tolerant nature of this assessment. If one or two of these measures fail, or if you get a false positive or something like that, it won't completely knock out your website. So if an attacker can compromise one of these security measures that you've used, one of these assessment mechanisms, it doesn't matter because there's still 5 others that will back it up. In reliability engineering, this is called derating. So you basically run a device at less than its maximum rated load, and that extends its lifetime. So at the moment, I only know of one browser that does anything like this, which is IE9 has their smart screen filter. So IE9 has a whole bunch of things all called smart screen, but this is specifically the one that checks the reputation of a download. Microsoft are really vague about exactly what the reputation of a download is. It seems to involve certificates and previous copies of this thing being installed on your machine. They don't seem to reveal much because they don't want the malware guys to counteract it. But basically what happens, generally if you download an executable, on most browsers it will say this type of download may harm your computer for every single executable you download. What this does, what the smart screen filter does, is it makes sure that 90% of your downloads no longer get this completely pointless warning. No matter how safe the thing is, it's whatever it is, straight from Microsoft. You would in theory still get this warning. This cuts out 90% of these pointless warnings, so you only get a warning when there is a chance that it really is a risky thing. So you're cutting out all the false alarms. Another thing it does is it takes effect immediately. So these browsers also have blacklists, Firefox and so on, and Microsoft obviously have blacklists, and there's a blacklist which is part of Microsoft's Smart Screen. The problem with this is that the attackers move much, much faster than the blacklists. So Microsoft has figures for this. In one example, the Smart Screen reputation-based downloading blocked 99% of attacks from the instant it was released. It's actually a very interesting graph if you look at it. The infection rate started at 0, at which point Smart Screen was already blocking it. 4 to 5 hours later it peaks, and then it starts dropping again. And 6 to 7 hours after it's already peaked, the first blacklists kick in. So basically they're way too slow to have any effect, because when they finally kicked in, the infection rates have pretty much dropped back down to zero again. One downside of this is we don't have any real evaluation of its effectiveness. In theory, if you just block all downloads, you can claim it's 100% effective. So on the other hand, it's still better than the absolutely nothing that the other browsers are doing. But yeah, we have figures from Microsoft, and obviously they want to show up in the best light, but there's been no third-party evaluation of how that goes up against the actual attacks. So okay, that's some proposals. There's a bunch of counter-arguments to this, and some of these have been around pretty much forever. The most obvious one is, okay, if we do this, our users will move to another browser. Typically, if you poke a bit harder, then, okay, we've never actually asked anybody whether they'll do this. We're absolutely certain they'll do this, even though we've never asked anyone. So, and again, security researchers have conducted surveys of users, and users have indicated that they expect ISPs to take steps to protect them. And that's quite normal. I mean, in the world where you expect a car manufacturer to build a car, and I mean, that has safety features built in. And pretty much everything, you've either got government legislation or fear of liability, so that the manufacturers will build in safety features. So users expect from standard everyday experience that when they're getting a product, the manufacturer of that product will go out of their way to make them safe. And they expect the same from browser vendors. They expect the browser vendors to proactively take steps to make them safe. So in practice, this has actually been evaluated by a couple of ISPs who have implemented walled gardens. There's one in the Netherlands called Access for All. And what they did was they detected all this toxic malware spew coming out of people's PCs and dropped them into a walled garden. And the walled garden said, you've been affected by a virus, click on this link to go to an antivirus vendor of your choice to disinfect your PC. And again, conventional wisdom is people would run away from their ISP in droves, but exactly the opposite happened. It increased users' confidence in the ISP because the users said, this ISP is taking steps to protect us. And that pretty much goes with what they'd already said previously in surveys, that they expect the ISPs or the vendors to protect them. So the only evidence we have for this, for taking these extra safety steps, is that it actually increases users' confidence and satisfaction in a service rather than decreasing it. Okay, what about other things? If the browser vendors aren't going to do anything, what about plugins? Well, first of all, it requires poking around in a huge amount of the browser's internals, doing these low-level lookups for AESs and TTLs and DNS lookups and so on. You'd have to modify a huge amount of the browser's internals. Much, much worse though, for non-technical users, which is the at-risk user group that you want to protect, plugins don't exist. So for the people who need them most, they're never going to have this service. Another thing, okay, put a local proxy on the user's PC, so they connect through the proxy does the filtering, and then goes out onto the internet. Again, users then need to know about the proxy, they need to install it. In some cases, you've got existing proxies that are break. It's pretty messy. You have a proxy at the ISP level, so the ISP does it all for you. This is really, really nasty for the bad guys because, for example, in the case of, let's say, showing one site for Google's web scan and another site for the end user, if it's at the ISP level, then it still looks like it's coming from the end user's PC, so they can't modify the site content because they don't know whether it's the ISP or the end user. Still, it requires a huge investment in infrastructure from the ISP. It'll affect performance. Well, again, you can use risk assessment heuristics to determine which sites need extra checking. You don't need to check every site. It's absolutely overkill if you're going to do these checks on every site. It's only on sensitive sites. And there's a bunch of other things. You can run checks in the background for red, you can do opportunistic lookups and so on and so forth, and caching and whatnot. Microsoft already does some of this stuff in Internet Explorer. So here's an example of a site that's worth checking. Is the site asking for user credentials, typically for a password? If it is, then it's worth checking because that's possibly a phishing site. You can do this very simply, for example, by checking for certain strings in the page URL or page contents, checking for situation-specific ones, like PayPal and eBay. These sites are so often phished that these things should be hard-coded into web browsers out of the box. If it looks like it's PayPal or eBay or whatever, you do some more checking because that's so frequently phished. So the whole goal of phishing is to require credentials. So any site that asks you for credentials should be prepared to have extra checks applied to it to make sure it's the real thing. You can check page contents for keywords or indicators that it's a high-value site. Impersonating a bank is very, very difficult without putting a whole lot of banking-related keywords onto a website. So if you've got a site that's full of banking-related keywords, do some more checking. Okay, the phishers can use image text and things like that, but then again, if you've got a site that consists entirely of image fragments and asks for a password, that's suspicious, so do more checking there. Here's a trick that the bad guys have been using for years and years and years in banking Trojans. So they have these huge databases with rule sets, they're basically expert systems, so that they know that if you're going to this particular bank, you can apply this set of rules to phish your information. The bad guys have been doing this for years, so find a banking Trojan, pull out the list of banks, put it into a browser, and if you go to that site, apply the checks just like the bad guys do. So that's for browser users and end users. You can do the same thing for CAs.